Hi friends, it's Lala. I'm so excited to finally be telling you my favorite books of 2018. I feel like I haven't really taken the opportunity to talk about these books very much at all, besides in my monthly wrap-ups. Usually I do like favorite books of the quarter installments throughout the year, and I didn't do that this year. And I feel like you might be surprised by some books that are on this list or some books that didn't make the list. So I think I'm premiering this video, which means we can chat live as you're watching it. So I would love to hear throughout this video like what books you were surprised are here, what books you think are missing, and I can tell you some even honorable mentions, and I'd love to chat with you as it's happening. I know there's some books that you'll see coming on this list if you watch my videos regularly, but there's definitely some books in this stack that I've only mentioned maybe once. So this year in total, I rated almost 30 books 5 stars. And so I'm only talking about 10 of them. But before I get started, one more thing. Definitely check out my Instagram because I'll be talking about more favorite books at the end of the year, kind of stuff that didn't make the list. And also I have a video called Everything I Read This Year, like my yearly stats, and I'll show you all of my 5 stars so you can get a total view of everything that I read and loved. This is just the top 10, which was hard to choose because, like I said, I read like 35-star books this year. So first up in my number 10 position, so my 10th favorite book of the year, is The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. This surprised me, that's for sure, because I honestly just didn't think I would love this as much as I did. It's written in verse, and it's about a girl who falls in love with slam poetry. Poetry books or books about poetry aren't something that I pick up a lot, but this just like moved me in such a way. I highly recommend the audiobook, which she narrates herself, and it is stunning. I cried. Not only did I cry reading poetry, but I cried listening to an audiobook. So like I said, it follows a girl who falls in love with slam poetry, joins a poetry club, gets introduced to slam poetry, and it's about her and her life. She's like going through relationships in here. She's dealing with her mother. Her family's very religious, and she is grappling with things that she doesn't agree with in religion. Certain aspects of her life and her relationships with boys and her body that she's told are wrong. She goes through a lot of struggles just with like self-image, and there are some really heavy topics in here. There's slut shaming and abuse and racism. Ziamata is dealing with a lot in her life and is expressing herself through this poetry that her mother rejects and doesn't want her involved with. And there are just some of the most beautiful passages I've ever read in this book. In my number 9 spot is I'm Afraid of Men by Vivek Shraya. It never fails that there is a short piece of nonfiction in my favorites. The one that especially moved me this year is I'm Afraid of Men. Vivek Shraya is a trans woman who goes over a bunch of different experiences that she's had, specifically with men, mostly with men growing up, and misogyny and toxic masculinity are topics in here, and how she grew up not as masculine as everyone wanted her to be, but not traditionally feminine enough that people will accept her as a trans woman. Especially as a trans woman of color, her experiences are very intersectional, and I thought this was really thoughtful and concise. And I know some critique is that it could be longer, but I thought it was absolutely perfect, and I'm definitely interested to read more from Vivek Shraya. In the number 8 spot is Undead Girl Gang by Lily Anderson. Of all these books, this is probably the most light-hearted. It deals with some pretty intense, heavy topics like this entire list does. Like, happy books don't tend to make my top 10, and this isn't happy, but it's the most lighthearted. It made me smile. It takes like kind of an intense, could be dramatic scenario, but does it in like a campy, silly way. So Undead Girl Gang follows a girl named Mila who dabbles in witchcraft, and her best friend dies, and supposedly by suicide, but she doesn't believe that. So she decides to raise her from the dead. But when she does that, she accidentally brings back 2 other girls who have died. And the story revolves around her finding out what really happened to them, tracking down a murderer who she believes killed all these girls. So it's like a zombie book, but it's fun at the same time, because while there's these intense topics, the girls like can't step foot a certain distance from Mila, or they start to like rot. And then these zombies like aren't listening to her, and they're going off and doing whatever and scaring people and ruining her whole investigation, basically. I liked everything about this. I liked that it was kind of contemporary with a speculative twist. I liked that our main character was fat. The fat rep was great. There's a little cute romance in here. It dealt with like grief and loss. That was really nicely done. Just highly recommend. Number 7 is my only mystery thriller that made this entire list. I read, the majority of books I read are mystery thrillers, but not very many of them end up 5 stars, and only one of them made my top 10. So it's If We Were Villains by ML Rio. I don't think this would be a surprise, because I stated in a vlog that this is one of my new favorite books of all time, and that I liked it even more than The Secret History, which it's comparable to, which was like my number 2 or 3 favorite book of last year. So If We Were Villains follows a group of Shakespeare actor students, and a tragedy occurs, and we're reading from the lead up to that tragedy, and then we're in another timeline 10 years later. We're following one of the characters in this group of friends. He's been in jail for the last 10 years because of this thing that happened, and we're finding out the truth about the situation. The pace of this book was so incredible. It's so well written. I can't wait to read more from ML Rio. It just leaves off at the perfect time and switches timelines, like right when you don't want it to, when you're about to find out something imperative to the plot, but it leaves you on the edge of your seat, and then you read another chapter in a different timeline, and then you come back to the reveal, and it's just so well paced. Besides the whole like mystery, just the friendship dynamic that exists in here, the sexual tension between so many of them, the power dynamic that is shifting among the group, and there's a lot of them acting, and a lot of Shakespeare. There's a lot of Shakespeare in here. So I recommend the audiobook for this too. It is quite good. In my number 6 spot is the book I think I most recently read and got added to my favorites list, and that's Blanca y Roja by Anna Marie McLemore. This, I never thought like a fairy tale retelling would be on my favorites list. Like, what? But this again is my perfect genre, contemporary with a speculative element. This follows a family who every single generation has 2 girls, and eventually at some point in their lives one of them will be taken by the swans. There's these swans, there's like a curse on the family, and one of them will become a swan at some point. And we follow the 2 characters, Blanca and Roja, and they are sisters, and they feel like they know which girl's going to be taken by the swans. One of them is clearly like the bad sister who gets in more trouble, the one who's not as nice and kind. So the story follows them when the swans first appear, and they know that it's almost time for whatever happens, whatever game they have to play or situation they're gonna get put into, or one of the swans will take them. But they're also protective of each other, and it's about the lengths that they'll go to save their sister. And there's also this whole other situation happening where each of the girls has a boy that she is involved with, who enter the story, and how they impact what the sisters go through. And just their characters are so interesting, and they're also kind of like animals at the same time. It's a mix of like Snow White and Rose Red and then Swan Lake. There are some really intense themes in here. One of them being abuse, and it was really hard to read. This gutted me. I sobbed reading this book. It was so hard to read, and it was so beautiful. Her writing is very flowery, magical realism, and it was incredible. All right, so we're halfway through. Let me know your guesses for my top 5. If there's any books that you've been waiting for that haven't shown up yet, tell me some of your predictions. So in my number 5 spot is my second nonfiction of this list. I'm gonna do some like quick stats at the end, which will be fun. It's Dead Mountain by Donnie Eicher. I love hiking, survival type stories. I had never heard of the Dyatlov Pass incident. I know it's like, now I know that it's this big conspiracy theory. I'd never heard of it. I just thought this was your traditional like first person telling of an experience somebody had hiking a mountain. I read those a lot and I love them. So me being completely ignorant to the situation, I had no idea that the story actually involves 8 different hikers back in 1959 who all died in mysterious circumstances on this mountain in Russia. And the story is told by Donnie Eicher, who is diving into the situation and trying to solve the mystery of what happened to all of these hikers. Dyatlov Pass is actually named after like the leader of this group of people on this hike, who was one of the many that died. And it was just such a fascinating story. And Donnie Eicher actually traveled to Russia. He's one of the only people, I think he's the guy who actually went and interviewed the people who were closest to this incident and visited where it occurred and talked to all these people and came up with what I think is the answer to the mystery. It's still unsolved, and basically these hikers, they were found sprawled across the mountain in various stages of undress. Like a lot of them didn't have their boots on in like one of the coldest places ever, and they were not dressed properly, and they hadn't brought their gear with them, but they were out on the mountain. Their tent was cut open from the inside, and it looked like they had were running from something. The mystery is fascinating. You can watch people's conspiracy theories on YouTube. In my opinion, he, along with all of these like scientists and whatever that he interviewed and tried to solve the mystery, he solved it, and his conclusion in the end makes complete sense to me, and it's absolutely crazy. And of course it's full of photos of the people and all the interviews and all the things that he learned, and then at the end it's basically the story, like what he thinks happened that night. And I highly recommend this. The audiobook, again especially, is amazing. In the number 4 spot is the first book that made it onto my top 10. I think I read this in March, and I was worried at that point that it had been like 3 months and I hadn't loved a book yet. And I was like, is this gonna be one of those years where I struggle to even pick a top 10? So I just have really fond memories of reading this and consistently chapter after chapter being like, this is it. This is the first like incredible book of the year. And it's The Astonishing Color of After by Emily X.R. Pan, which I've seen on a couple people's favorites videos this year, which is really cool. This again is like my favorite thing, contemporary with a speculative or fantastical or magical realism element. It follows a girl whose mother commits suicide and she believes her mother has turned into a bird, and she's trying to figure out what that means and connect with her mother and track down her mother. The majority of the book takes place in Taiwan, where she goes to connect with her mother's side of the family who she's never met before. So it's a culture shock. She doesn't speak the language. She doesn't know anything about her mother's family. And of course, she is grieving. And this is a book about grief and acceptance. And I love that we covered mental illness in such a thorough way. It's such a complex situation and it's not discussed, especially in certain cultures. So I really appreciated what this book did. I've heard some feedback that at almost 500 pages this book was too long, which I disagree with so much because I was just so into this story and her experiences. This book has one of my favorite relationships like ever, and it's so thoughtfully placed. There's just little slivers of it, and it's actually mostly in flashbacks, and her being in this relationship is a huge part of her grief because her mother was committing suicide while she was having her first kiss with this boy, and it's just so heartbreaking and was the first book of the year that made me sob. Now, the next two are hard actually to decide between. You know what's funny is my top three all have the word girl in the title. So in my number 3 spot is Girls of Paper and Fire by Natasha Nyong. This is like the highest fantasy book on this list, the most fantastical book. And I really liked how the fantasy was done because it's not a lot of like magic, people performing magic and having magical powers. While that does exist, it's more so like the world and there's creatures. There are 3 different classes. There are humans, there are human demon hybrids who have different like animal characteristics, and then there's full-on demons who look like really scary animals. It's hard to explain, but there is a king in this book. He is a demon king, and there are 9, I think it's 9 girls chosen every year to be his paper girls, which are like his sex slaves essentially. And while she is in the king's palace and dealing with all of these horrific experiences along with the other girls, she falls in love with another one of the paper girls. And it's just a really feminist book, and it's the girls discovering like that they should have more power than they do. They're a very oppressed group of people. It was devastating. It was really hard to read at some points. It's relatively graphic in my opinion, revolving around girls from the age of like 14 to 18 in their experiences. It's very timely and intense and just incredibly written, and I'm really excited to read more from her. The next book in my number 2 spot, my next girl book, is Girls Burn Brighter by Shobha Rao, which I just want to say, like, this wasn't on my TBR. I actually had no intention of reading this. It was sent to me not for like here, I'm gonna send you this book, read it and review it. It was, I'm gonna send you this book so you can post about it on Instagram and run a giveaway. And I just want to mention that because like I just picked this up on a total whim and had no plans of, I wasn't even interested in this book. And it just goes to show that like your favorite books, for me, my favorite books can just come from the most unlikely places. To me, this sounded like, and for the first quarter, I was convinced that this was just torture porn, which is a word that we use when an author just writes characters just going through horrific event after horrific event, and for no real purpose for the characters or the narrative, just to elicit an emotional response from the reader. And then about the halfway point, I realized that this was one of my favorite books of all time. So this book starts in India with two young girls, Savitha and Purnima, meeting for the first time and working together, sewing saris. And their friendship is really important for each other because it first introduces them to a connection with somebody and imagining a life beyond their like just unhappy reality. And then a horrific turn of events splits them up, and in alternating chapters we read just the most horrific things anybody could go through. There's human trafficking, there's domestic violence, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of trials that they go through, but their friendship is what keeps them going and wanting to one day reconnect. And one of them is still in India and one of them ends up in the States, and all the things that they go through, all the things they sacrifice and all the things they have to do to survive, and just their memories of each other gets them through. Oh, fuck. It's so good. I can't take it. And we're on to the last book. My absolute favorite book of the year, in the #1 spot, is Girl Made of Stars by Ashley Herring Blake. This is a hard-hitting YA contemporary following the main character, Mara, whose twin brother Owen has been accused of rape by his girlfriend, who's also one of Mara's closest friends. I've read a lot of books about sexual assault and rape culture, even some in this list, and I've never read one that does it as well as this, that takes the perfect stance on it, but also shows it from all different angles, from all of the people on the sidelines. She obviously believes her friend, and this is a topic that's come up in her life already, in her family, that you believe women who accuse men of assault. But obviously it's never hit close to home for her before, and now she's grappling with accepting it and accepting the closest person in her life having done this horrible act, and really just how to deal with it and how she can help the situation. I think it's really important, and it's not something I've really seen in many of these books on this topic, sexual assault within a relationship. And I think it's a really important part, is when it happens within a relationship, it should still be treated the same. Again, like a lot of books on this list, this is one of the few this year that made me cry. It was really impactful for me, and it's just so important. And not only are we dealing with that situation, but Mara has, you know, her own relationships that we delve into, and she has a romantic relationship in here. She's a bisexual protagonist, which is always, I mean, honestly nice to read from, and not something we get a lot in literature in general. And her relationship is really interesting and was really, I think, carefully placed in here didn't take over the book, but was a nice element. And Mara's dealing with her own trauma that's been brought up because of this. All of her friendships were really well developed, and her family and the grief, not to like try to make it about the family, it's about the girl and it's about the situation, but we get to see how the family deals with it and grieves over the situation. I loved it a lot. Obviously, highly recommend. So those are my 10 favorite books of the year. I would love to know if you've read any of them, if you liked any of them, and a couple stats just to throw out there, because I do a whole video about stats, but this didn't really fit in there, and I just thought it was interesting. Of my 10 favorites, like I said, 4 out of the 10 have the word girl in the title, which is interesting. 4 out of the 10 were fantasy or had fantasy elements, which I think is interesting, because I feel like I don't pick up a lot of popular fantasy. So sometimes I say I don't love fantasy, but my favorites lists always include a lot of books that have fantasy elements. 6 out of the 10 were YA and 4 of them were adult. 9 out of the 10 were new to me authors that I'd never read before. I think 6 of the 10 were debut books from those authors. 2 out of the 10, like I said, were nonfiction, which is always weird for me because I don't pick up nonfiction very often, but when I do, I usually end up loving it. Only 2 out of the 10 didn't come out this year, so 8 of the 10 were 2018 releases. 4 of the 10 were ARCs sent to me early from publishers. 9 out of 10 of the authors are women, and 9 of the 10 were standalone books, so only one of them, Girls of Paper and Fire, at this point is part of a series and will have a sequel. And that's it. Those are my top 10. I could mention 20 more books that got 5 stars. I could mention at least like 10 of those as honorable mentions, but that would take another, what, 20-30 minutes. So thank you so much for watching. Let me know your favorite books of the year if you want, or which one of these ones you're going to read, because I bet no one's read all 10. Maybe that should be your goal. Try to read all 10 of my favorite books of the year. Why? I don't know. Just because I'm a narcissist. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you later. Bye.